Hi folks, this is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report. You know, in giving a fishing report, there's so much about fishing in our area. There's all the different species and all the different waters and all the different ways of fishing. And it becomes a pretty expansive opportunity for me to talk about fishing in our area. But I'll tell you, we've just had some major tournaments. And because I'm so involved with those, I get a chance to talk to the anglers from all over the country. And one of the things that we can learn from this is not only have the great opportunity of seeing these anglers hold their trophy fish up at the weigh-ins, but to get to talk to them and learn how they catch these fish. And you got to remember, whenever you talk to a fisherman that fishing is a real important thing to them, they're going to guard their secrets. They're not going to tell you where they go. They're not going to willingly tell you what they use, because this is their up over every other fisherman. This is their opportunity to be successful. And it's often very difficult for me to pass on to you what people don't want to give me. But a lot of these anglers shared a lot of the ways that they caught their fish in the St. Lawrence. And I think it's important because we can learn from them, and we can use the same techniques and go out and probably have the same luck. Remember, these people come here from other states. They've never fished this area, a lot of them. And so they're just like us when we go out into that big, magnificent river. Where do you go? How do I do this? And some of the things that they used over this last week were really interesting to learn about. An old technique that we never really talk about is the Carolina rig. And they call it the ball and chain. They said they brought out the old ball and chain that was successful for them. And what you're doing really is dragging along the bottom, your bait along the bottom. You do have the risk of gobies, but that's where those fish are going to be, near the bottom where they can feed on gobies. Another technique that really works for them, and we talk about it all the time, is drop shots. But when the anglers would get up on stage, or when they'd just be talking to me in private, they'd say the baits that they use. And one of the things that a lot of these anglers depend on is the Berkeley flatworm. This is something, if you can find Berkeley flatworms, and I know Walmart sells them, and I always love to give promotion to other bait shops, not just Walmart. But anyway, Walmart does sell these. And these are something you can use not only in the St. Lawrence, but any body of water you go in, and fish are going to want to hit them. They're little flat worm-shaped things that look like little gobies or little minnows or leeches, or, they represent a lot of things, and they're extraordinarily successful. This is something that if you just armed yourself with a number of Berkeley flatworm packages, you'd be all set for almost any place you go. Another one of the things that a lot of the anglers used is the age-old tubes. They talked about using tubes. Now, Berkeley makes a max scent tube that I think is fantastic, and I've talked to you about it before. It comes in a number of natural colors, and the tubes seem to work well for a lot of these anglers. And a lot of them talked about using chatterbaits. That's something that you can't go wrong with. I know when in the early part of the season, when I'm fishing for northern pike or anything that hits, often what hits is these big smallmouth hitting a chatterbait. And I'll tell you what, it's something you can't fail with. They have a little blade on the front of them that causes a very noticeable vibration in the rod tip. You can feel when that bait's coming through the water, you know that it's working. That chatterbait causes any soft plastic that you rig on it to really wiggle unbelievably. Has its own unique action, and the fish can't resist it. And chatterbaits are good for just about anything. So these are some of the baits that these anglers were using. I didn't hear any of them talking about spinnerbaits, and yet spinnerbaits work really well. You can't use spinnerbaits very effectively in deep water. They're a shallow water bait. But an awful lot of the anglers said they were still catching their fish shallow. I'll tell you another phenomena of these tournaments is often in the past you would never see anglers that entered these tournaments holding up largemouth bass. They didn't target largemouth. They didn't figure the St. Lawrence River's largemouth were big enough to be of significance. But I'll tell you what, in the last tournament, the Tackle Warehouse tournament, one of the anglers scored highly each day, and his whole limit of fish were largemouth bass. He had bass over 6 pounds in 2 of the 3 days that he weighed in. So our largemouth fishing is really, really catching on with people. They realize that they don't have to go far to get into waters that have largemouth. Any of the bays, or they were catching their fish in basically 10 feet of water. But largemouth bass are here in big numbers. And I hate to say this because it's something that I really enjoy, and I really get a kick out of being able to go to some of these backwater bays that we have in our area and catch largemouths, but now that secret's out. But anyway, largemouth bass played a big role in this last tournament. And you can use like spinner baits or chatter baits or surface baits to catch largemouth. And they're really effective. Anyway, these are some of the tips from this week, folks. Until next time, this is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report. Hi, folks. This is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report. Well, you know, we have a lot more than just bass and tournament bass out in the St. Lawrence River. And one of the people that came to one of our tournaments, he's been fishing for years and years, and he was one of the most successful walleye fishermen I knew back a decade or so ago when there were organizations in Messina and Ogdensburg that were helping stock walleyes. He was always a part of these organizations. He was always one of the top fishermen. And he came to one of our last tournaments, and I was talking to him beside his car, and he told me, I said, Bob, have you been out fishing walleyes at all? And he said, yeah. He said he'd been catching some really big walleyes on the Canadian side. He said much bigger than what you would usually catch in any numbers. We're talking about fish 28 to 30 inches long. And he also made the statement to me, he says, you know, when I go out around here, he says, the number of walleyes is astounding. He said, I catch so many small walleyes that you never saw before. I don't know where they're all coming from, he said, but boy, we've got a number of walleyes. And, you know, recently, this has been one of our biggest concerns with New York deciding not to stock walleyes in our area anymore in the St. Lawrence River. And so where are they going to come from? How is our walleye population going to persist? Well, the DEC feels that it is persisting. And Bob, what he was telling me, really supports that. He says, I haven't seen so many small walleyes as I'm catching right now. Now, one of the ways Bob fishes the St. Lawrence most of the time is he has become an avid perch fisherman. And so now for him to be catching walleyes, it's sort of a throwback to what it once was. So we do have a number of walleyes out there in the river from what people are telling me. And, you know, I do believe that walleyes are a magic fish for our region. I think that most local anglers, that's one of their key targets, that they want to go out and catch walleyes. We know they taste better than just about any fish, but there's something about them. There's an allure to walleyes. It's different than a lot of fish. I know when I'm fishing the tributary rivers, if I can ever find a spot that holds a school of walleyes, I think I've found gold. And that's what it's like for me. And I know that whenever I mention walleyes on some of these shows, and people from other areas hear me say walleyes, they immediately tune in to hear more about it, because walleyes have that kind of drawing power. And we really do have wonderful walleye fishing in this area, not just in the St. Lawrence, but in our tributaries as well. And most people don't search them out in like the Grass or Racket River, but there's really good populations of walleyes there. Anyway, I was glad to talk to Bob, and I was glad to hear that he feels that the walleyes are really predominant and prevalent right now out in the St. Lawrence River. Until next time, folks, this is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report. Hi, folks. This is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report. You know, what I want to talk about right now is fishing locomotion. It's the best way I can put it. How we go about getting to fish in the area that we want to fish. Do we have a bass boat? Do we have another kind of craft that we can get on the water that can travel in shallow water? That's always a factor. Or do we wade like I do. Wading is a way of locomotion as well. It gives me the opportunity to cover a good area of water and cover at my own speed and be in control of what I do. But there's so many disadvantages to wading, to other type of fishing. You have to weigh all those in when you decide how you want to go fishing. Well, I recently had a chance to fish in something that takes me way back to when I first started doing TV shows. Every show that I did was out of a Coleman crawdad. That's a little tub of a boat that two people can lift and carry for a distance. And you set it in the water, and you're sitting in like a bathtub in the water. But there's so many advantages to a boat like this. And I recently had a chance to fish in one of my buddy Alex's Bass Raiders. And I really need to tell you about some of the advantages to something like that. You know, in the same water, we were fishing one of the rivers. And in these waters, we normally can go with a canoe or a kayak. But one of the disadvantages of a canoe is a lot of people feel very unstable in a canoe. You know, they don't want to get in because they're fear of tipping over. And canoes can be really tippy. You got to have a sense of balance and sort of feel as one with the canoe. Once you do that, they don't feel as tippy. But anyway, these Bass Raiders, as they're called, these little tubs of boats, maybe 10 feet long, and they weigh a considerable, and they're made out of fiberglass or some material similar. And they give you the opportunity to fish bodies of water that you wouldn't be able to wade very easily. And you can't get a big boat in. And if you don't feel stable in a canoe, then you can't fish these waters. But by getting one of these boats, what the advantage is you're sitting out there in something so stable that I know when Linda and I talk about going fishing, she's scared to death of falling in and drowning because she can't swim, and canoes can be so tippy. But something like this is the ideal for a couple members of the family that would like to go out fishing together. That you can sit in there, and if you can relax when you're fishing, you're going to enjoy fishing a lot more. And if you're not feeling tippy all the time or worried about falling in, these kind of boats are really a great find. And the day I spent on one of our rivers fishing in this Bass Raider really made me realize all the advantages to something like this. We're able to cover the same amount of water we would with a canoe. You can, when you get to real shallow water, you can get out and drag it through the shallow parts, then get back in the canoe and sit and relax and cast and fish, or back in the Bass Raider. There really is something you ought to look at if you've wondered about how to fish some of these bodies of water around us, because again, our area is water everywhere. And one of the advantages is that most of this water that exists everywhere is full of fish. It's just an incredible opportunity that we have in this area. And the other thing is that there's access to most of this water where you don't have to pay, or you don't have to feel like you're trespassing on somebody else's land. And it's important that you realize that if the shoreline does go through somebody else's land, it's important that you do get permission before you walk through it. But again, the type of way we fish is so critical. And I think so often we've never spoken about these. I know I fished all over the continent in this little crawdad, and they they made wonderful fishing memories for me, and they could you as well. Until next time, folks, this is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report. Hi, folks. This is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report. You know, we've had a lot of tournaments lately, but one of the things that I wanted to pass on that I've noticed from enjoying the weigh-in for these different tournaments is some of the fish that are brought in. You know, our tournaments really bring people from all over the country to catch smallmouth bass in sizes that don't exist in other parts of the country and the world. But a lot of these tournaments now are being, I know that I've seen days where the biggest fish brought in for that day was a largemouth bass. More and more of these anglers are fishing for largemouth and bringing them in. And with our last big bass blowout, you know, the biggest fish for the entire weekend that was taken was a big largemouth bass, and it wasn't caught very far away. What largemouth give us in our area is something really special, and this is a fabulous time for fish for them. You know, if people come to visit us and aren't really familiar with fishing the St. Lawrence, it's an awful lot easier for them to have a great day fishing if they can go back into one of our bays. They don't have to worry about how to fish the current or how deep they're going to go and fish for largemouth bass. And we've got tremendous populations of largemouth bass in the river. I think that is becoming more and more a part of our attraction. You know, even these big tournaments with the pros that fish all over the country, there were days where you look at the bag that they bring in and you look at the fish they hold up on stage and you see, oh, there's another green fish. That's what they call them, largemouth. But they are a wonderful species, and they're very prevalent here. We have such great largemouth fishing. And again, it's something anybody can do. It's one of the easiest ways to fish, to put a Senko worm on and throw it out there and wait to feel that tap. And that's one of the most successful ways to fish for largemouth bass. It's something that whole families can enjoy, I think, far more readily than trying to go out and learn how to fish a drop shot or something that is part of fishing the deep current in the St. Lawrence. Until next time, folks, this is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report.